Hello, everybody. How are you doing? All right, so on this episode, we'll see how this goes. I'm going to talk about one of Carl Jung's books. So, mostly I've been going through books from Jordan Peterson's literature/philosophy list. I've been focusing on fiction books, which have been really good. But this past summer, I read Aion, The Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, I think is the subtitle, by Carl Jung. It's one of his collected works. And this is going to be really weird. We're going to get weird. Because Carl Jung was a weird guy. And I'm not claiming that I understand even close to fully what he was talking about. But it's weird because Carl Jung, so Freud formalized the idea of the unconscious. I think a lot of people were talking about it, but he's famous for maybe sort of coining the phrase, and now it's taken for granted that we have an unconscious, which you don't really think about. You just kind of mention in passing, like, oh, you're unconscious, must be stressed about something. But Freud thought a lot about that, and it was kind of a revolutionary idea. And then Jung, maybe the right way of thinking of it is sort of took the mantle where Freud left off and really dug deep into the unconscious, and he dug deep into his own unconscious and wrote a lot about it and really came to a fantastical, mythological, sophisticated understanding of the different aspects of the unconscious. And it's all scientifically unprovable, but very convincing once you sort of start to understand what Jung was talking about. And so my confession is I didn't really read Aion. I mostly listened to the podcast about Aion by the Uberboyos, Steph Boyo and Jimmy Boyo, and they have like a 25-part conversation about this book. And their motivation was, well, this is, according to Jordan Peterson, this is the scariest book he's ever read. He said that in one of his interviews. But he hasn't really talked about it much, except by saying that it was the scariest book he ever read. And Jung in it came up with solutions to problems that nobody has ever even thought of. And I don't know if that's how I would phrase this book, but it is weird because, anyway, I'll get into that, but at first I just want to really recommend the Uberboyos. They're hilarious. They're two young guys. One's from England, one's from Ireland. They're constantly joking about the other's nationality, which is always good fun. And they're very up on current in-jokes of the internet, like memes and stuff like that. And so it was a very good conversation. I don't think they would call themselves experts on Jung, but the way that they break it down, they read the whole book on the internet, on YouTube, and they would just read a paragraph and then they'd talk about it and then give examples from real life and stuff like that. So it was very helpful for me. I don't think I would have been able to actually read this book and get anything out of it. And but if you wanna dive into this book, I recommend listening to their podcast. They're very funny. They have some good insights. And then also on the website iaap.com or .org, there are some online abstracts about every chapter in Aion in any of Carl Jung's collected works. So it's kind of like spark notes for Jung, and it's obviously doesn't give you the depth, but it gives you the gist of what you just read, and that helped me a lot. So I listened to that podcast, and as I was listening to that podcast, I read Man and His Symbols, which is a collection of essays by Carl Jung and some of his associates. A lot of it was about dream reading, which really is a good way into Jungian psychology, I think, because he talks about a lot of stuff, but that's what I've read most about of what he talks about, and it's a lot of what he did in his clinical practice was dream reading and connecting the archetypes in people's dreams to their meaning in what he calls the collective unconscious, which is basically how these symbols have been represented throughout time. He was insanely well read. He taught himself Latin and Greek and all these languages to just so he could read as much mythology from time immemorium as he could possibly get his hands on. He was a complete bookworm to end all bookworms. I don't think anyone has the literary knowledge that this man has had ever. And trying to read his works is so dense because he's referencing all these things in different languages from different years BC as an example of the archetype that he's talking about, and it's just so densely packed. But that gave him a unparalleled knowledge of symbols, and so you could tell him a dream, and he could be like, "Oh yeah, that character in your dream was." There's a parallel in some historical myth of the Syrians back in, 420 BC or something like that. So the idea of a collective unconscious, as I understand it, is that when you're dreaming or doing what he calls active imagination, not all of the, but some of the things that you're dreaming about are not produced by you. And if you wake up and record your dream, I guarantee you if you do it enough, you'll come across something that's like, I don't know where that came from. A lot of things you can say, oh, that's because when I was a kid this happened, or that reminds me of this friend that I have, or something. You can relate it to your own life experience. But some things are just there, and those are the archetypes, and so he's developed this idea that as a collective humanity we have these patterns that we all recognize that are common to humans. So like an example of this would be the dragon. Everybody knows what a dragon is, but nobody knows where the dragon came from. And it's across different cultures. You've got the Chinese dragon. You've got, every culture sort of has their own dragon. And it's like, what the heck is that? It's a lizard with wings that breathes fire. And it has treasure. Or a girl tied up, And it's ubiquitous. It's like, well, that's an archetype. You can't explain where it came from, but everybody knows what it is, and it's always been around. It's this idea. So he starts off this book, Aion, by talking about the structure of the psyche. So the first 4 chapters are ego, shadow, anima, and self. And what I understood was your ego is your personality that you project. It can be something that it can be like a facade, something that you project to have a certain type of reaction from people, or it can be who you truly think you are, but it is the part of yourself that you manifest, I guess you could say. So that's your ego, and whenever you dream, if you are in the dream, then you represent your ego. And then there's the shadow, and Jordan Peterson has talked a lot about the shadow, and the shadow is a character in your dream, usually that's very dark and sinister. And it is basically that part of yourself which is capable of doing atrocious things that you tend to repress. It's the part of you that is anti your ego. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about, soldiers will go to war and they will have a very clear idea of who they are, and then they will get into a situation where they commit a terrible, terrible atrocity. Torture, rape, murder, war crimes, something like that. And they come back and they're traumatized because they cannot believe that they were capable of that. Well, that was their shadow possessing them. The dark parts of our soul. And so then he talks, so that's another archetype. That's part of the structure of the psyche. So you've got your ego, you've got your shadow, you've got your anima, or if you're a woman, you have your animus. And the anima was harder for me to understand. But it is basically, if you're a male, it is the inner woman. So it's maybe one way of looking at it would be your feminine side, but that doesn't quite explain it all of the way. In Man and His Symbols, they talked a lot about the anima as it appears in dreams, and that was very hard for me to understand. So this one guy was dreaming. I'm going to talk a lot about Man and His Symbols because it's a lot easier to understand than Aion. And it was really good, and it got me into dream reading for about a month, and it was a pretty valuable experience. Since then, I've kind of stopped remembering my dreams as vividly, and so I don't know what that's about. But the end goal of this whole dream reading thing seems to be a process of what Carl Jung would call individuation, and so your dreams is basically your unconscious manifesting. And so I was talking with my wife, and she's like, I had this really weird dream that I think represents this speech that I had to give a few weeks ago that I haven't really thought about since I gave it. I just kind of gave it, that's over with. She was nervous about it, but whatever, it's over with. And then she had this dream about it, and she said, I think, and we've been talking about this reading that I've been doing, and she said, I think my subconscious has been stressing about that speech that I gave, although my consciousness I haven't thought about it at all, so my consciousness has kind of repressed it, but it's still something that I need to deal with because my subconscious is bringing it up in my dreams. And so that's kind of at least maybe part of what the purpose of a dream is to make the unconscious conscious. And so it's trying to communicate these things with you that are happening deep down that you aren't necessarily conscious of. And so it's kind of the attempt of your psyche to say, hey, there's some things that you need to deal with. Or even here's what's been going on, and here's a narrative representation of the maturation cycle of your psyche. Here's what's really going on with you, and I'm going to represent it in a narrative form for your consciousness to make sense of. But if you're not paying attention to your dreams and dealing with things, especially if they're really big deals, if they're a really big deal, like if you had some kind of trauma, you might have nightmares. But if you don't deal with those nightmares, you're going to keep having them. And so it's like if you do not make what is unconscious conscious, then it's going to keep boiling underneath. And so I've noticed this with myself. Sometimes I will have very dark moments of contemplation on things that really disturb me, but it's all conscious contemplation, and I get done with that and I'm like, man, I really regret having spent that time thinking about that. I kind of go into the darkness, but I never dream about those topics, and I think that's because I deal with them consciously. So maybe it's always been a negative thing, but maybe that's a positive spin on when I go into my dark spells, I guess you could say. So anyway, the anima, if you're a man, you have an anima. If you're a woman, you have an animus. And the anima is, in your dream, a woman figure, usually mysterious woman that, the other hypothesis is that the psyche always wants to be balanced. So you've got masculine, feminine, you've got light, dark, ego, shadow. And so if you're a male, the balance to that would be your feminine side. And if the feminine side gets too big, that's not a good thing. Then you're anima possessed and you become contentious and complaining and blah, 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 and that sort of thing. Carl Jung's words, not mine. If it's repressed, then you become a boorish, hyper masculine, toxic guy. But the anima apparently also has its own personality. And so, like in a dream, it oftentimes mythologically represents a sort of a guide, right? So in Sleeping Beauty, you've got the little fairies that help the prince get out of trouble, and they're sort of a positive anima figure. And then you've got the Wicked Witch, and that's the negative aspect of the anima. I'm not really sure if I had any dreams where my anima showed up, so I'm not even sure if I believe in it. The part about the psyche being balanced makes sense to me, but I don't really know what my representation of an anima would be personally. The shadow makes a lot of sense to me, but the anima, and the way Carl Jung talks about it is he's very vague. He doesn't really define anything in concrete terms because there's a danger in doing that, obviously. But he makes it very confusing. So maybe some of you can comment about the anima or their own anima experience. I had one dream where this woman showed up on a jet ski, and she was kind of a Native American, long-haired, very beautiful, bohemian type of free spirit that was just kind of riding on this wave next to me, and it was kind of a tranquil moment, really, really fun, dreamy kind of dream that I had, and I was like, well, maybe, I didn't know who she was, so maybe that was my anima manifesting to make me more free-spirited or something, enjoy life more, but I don't know. I don't know. This is all very complicated stuff. So, but he ends up talking a lot about, so we covered those first couple chapters. He ends up talking a lot about Christ as the symbol of the self. Hang on a second, I'm going to pause this really quick. Okay, so I am a Christian, and I feel like I do have a personal relationship with Jesus, have for a long time. And so but I also am a student of literature, and I understand that, and I've listened to a lot of Jordan Peterson, and I understand that, Christ is also an archetype. I do believe he's a real person. I believe he's real. He is God, and he's ruling and reigning right now. But the way that Jordan Peterson represents him a lot, he doesn't deny the historical reality, but he represents him more as an idea. And I think he gets that from Carl Jung, because Carl Jung represents him as an idea. Although I think Carl Jung is a type of Christian. And I'm not here to judge sort of the conditions of these men's souls. You know, I've learned a lot from both of them. But whenever he talks about Christ, it's always, I'm not really sure what to think, because it's kind of like, you know, if you have a relationship with your spouse, but then you start talking about your spouse as a psychological phenomenon, it's always kind of weird. But I'll do my best to talk about what he talks about with Christ. He says Christ is the symbol, the archetypal symbol of the self. So now chapter 4 is about the self. And the way I understand it is the self is kind of, you've got your ego, you've got your shadow, you've got your anima, there's a couple other parts of your psyche, but the self is everything contained. It's everything about the consciousness, the unconscious, the id. I don't know if Freud believed in the id or if that was just Jung. But yourself is sort of the totality of who you are, and Christ is the manifestation of a completely, fully individuated self, which is a good idea. I think he is represented in the biblical scriptures as the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He's kind of the top of the hierarchy, as Jordan Peterson would say, but also representative of every strata of the hierarchy. He's outside the hierarchy. You know, he's a fisherman, he's a carpenter, he's a king, he's a criminal, depending on, you know, how you look at him and who he manifests himself to. And so at this point in the book, Carl Jung starts to get into less about the individual and more about the collective. And he starts talking about Christ has been our symbol that we all look to. Whether you're Christian or not, he's representative of the highest good in our society. And that's coming to an end. And I do believe that we're at the end of a Christian age right now in our culture, in our worldwide thinking. You know, Europe has been under a process of secularization very rapidly. You know, the same with America and all around the world. I think Christianity is growing underground in some other countries like China. But the West has, by and large, abandoned Christ. And when Carl Jung talks about this, he talks a lot about how this was predicted in astrology, and that's where the title of this book comes in. Aion means an age. And so then it starts getting really weird, because he starts talking about astrology, and I've always just rolled my eyes at astrology. You know, like, what are you? Are you a Virgo, Aquarius, whatever? It's like, oh, give me a break. But there's also these astrological ages. And so the age of, hold on. So the age of Aries was from 2000, roughly 2000 BC to the year of Christ, like 1 AD. I always not really sure when it starts. Does it start at 0? And then the age of Pisces was from then on to like now. Like roughly they last about 2,000 years, and they are marked by political historical events. And a lot of this astrological study like looks at the titles of these ions. Like the age of Aries is the age of the ram. The age of Pisces, the symbol is these two fishes swimming in different directions. And it's kind of like the story of history is mapped onto the stars. And every 2,000 years it changes to a different ion. And it's like, who came up with this? I don't know. But there's, depending on how you interpret it, it seems to have some kind of actual, like it's the stuff that happened in the age of Aries does relate to that ion and that symbolism of the ram. The stuff that happened in the age of Pisces, you know, the fish was used as a symbol for Christianity. You know, you see the fish bumper sticker on the back of people's cars. Jesus was a fisher of men. But there's two of them, right? And so it was interpreted in this book and then by other people like Nostradamus, which he talks about in the book, that, okay, the first 1,000 years of this ion is going to be the age of Christ, and then you've got the fish swimming in the other direction. The next 1,000 years is going to be a move away from that. And that's the age of, I don't know, the Antichrist. But then you look into it historically, and it's like sort of halfway through that ion, you've got the Renaissance, which was the birth of the Enlightenment ideals. From that you get scientific theory, and then, not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but the whole collective mindset shifts from looking at the spiritual to looking at the empirical. And they talk a lot about this in the Uberboyo's podcast, which is just brilliant. And one thing that I was totally unaware of was that when the scientific worldview first started, what gave birth to it, it had its origins in the supernatural. And so another thing that Carl Jung talks a lot about, which was pretty far over my head, was alchemy. But alchemy was this really esoteric practice of people. They were manipulating matter, and a lot, like, the general understanding of alchemy was it was trying to turn lead into gold, right? You're trying to manipulate matter by cooking it, by doing different sort of chemical experiments to get at the true form, sort of a Platonic idea there, that like matter in its essence is more than to what meets the eye. Sort of like when you look at somebody, you say you have a soul. Matter has a soul, and if we can do these ritualistic, sort of quasi-spiritual, quasi-scientific processes to it, we can turn it into its true form. And so they were trying to manipulate the spirit of this metal to turn it into gold. And it just sounds kind of crazy, and it is. But Carl Jung looked at that and he said, no, there was some deep psychological merit to that practice. They were manifesting this psychological process that they were going through and projecting that onto the matter. And a lot of them didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't understand the psychological significance of it, but some of them did. And it sort of morphed into this idea of creating the Philosopher's Stone, which was, if we can figure out how to manipulate matter, we can create this thing called the Philosopher's Stone, which is all spiritual substance is contained in this stone, which is matter. So it's kind of the melding of the spiritual and the material. And that, a lot of alchemy is lost, and a lot of it was practiced underground because a lot of people thought it was crazy, and it kind of was. It's like, what are you guys doing? And they're like, we don't know, but it's of the utmost importance. And so it was this stuff that was done underground intensely spiritual, although they didn't really, maybe they didn't know what was spiritual, what they exactly that they were doing, but it had so much meaning to these people. And Carl Jung talks a lot about alchemy. I've tried to read Psychology and Alchemy. I made it through the first 3 chapters, and it's insanely dense. But he spent, I think, the last half of his life, at least his professional life, studying alchemy and collecting all of these strange esoteric texts. And a lot of them were written in code. He had to decode them. And so why am I saying all this? Because he was able to see the sort of their true intentions, whether they knew what they were or not, was this psychological process of finding your own true spirit, sort of this process of individuation, casting aside all of these parts of yourself that are not real, that maybe, it's the process of integrating your shadow, integrating your anima, becoming whole, becoming psychically completely balanced, a truth teller, that sort of thing, and casting off all of these falsehoods. They were doing that process with the metal. But really what they were doing, even though they didn't understand it, was doing the process within their own soul. And so that practice of alchemy, eventually nobody did it anymore, right? It became obsolete, but it sort of led into modern day chemistry. And so eventually they figured out, there are some actual things that we can do with these metals. And so they developed the periodic table from that. And then, all that stuff that we were doing, trying to turn it into gold, that was not real science. But from that, it was useful in the sense that from that, we were able to come up with real science. And so science there's this idea that it's like we've figured out how to view the world scientifically, and from that we know truth. And you just have to have this rational worldview, do the scientific process, do things step by step, and you can actually figure out anything you want to figure out. We proved that God doesn't exist because we now have science, right? We've proved that all these beliefs, all these myths that man used to look to, you don't need those anymore because now we have science. And so that's where the Aion split, from the fish going one way to the fish going the other way. People were looking towards Christ, and then halfway through they started looking towards the scientific worldview, and that's where you get materialist atheism and stuff like that. But that shift did have spiritual beginnings. And one thing I learned about in the Uberboyo podcast was, I think it was actually Isaac Newton had a dream, supernatural dream one day, where an angel or some kind of supernatural figure came to him in the woods and told him, nature will be conquered by number and reason. And that's like, whoa, okay. So, and then the more I learn about science and how it's driven by Jordan Peterson's debate with Sam Harris, very confusing, and I don't think I watched all of them because it's just like they talk about so much stuff, but hearing other people talk about it and hearing him talk about it, sort of how he was able to collect a gestalt working, like a working, statement to say about it that's boiled down, was what they came away with from that was, you cannot actually derive a moral compass from facts. And so the scientific process is just facts. But the act of doing a scientific experiment, you need a moral compass to have a direction to go, because there's so many infinite number of facts that you have to be able to sort through them to generate some kind of a direction that you're going with this manipulation of the facts in your scientific experience. So if you don't have a higher good, a higher moral, the scientific worldview is not going to work. Science itself is not enough. You have to have a direction that drives that. And medicine is a really good example of this, because a lot of people think it's a science. It's not a science. It uses science, but it's all oriented towards health and wellness. What sort of scientific experiments can we do to make people well? So it has an orientation, right? Science itself does not have an orientation. It's completely objective. And so that's one thing I learned. I'm all over the place. I lost my train of thought. Okay, so we're sort of at the end of an age right now. We're at the end of this Aion of Pisces. And the next Aion, and they last roughly 2,000 years, is the Aion of Aquarius. And nobody really knows what's going to happen, but it seems like, and maybe I have this wrong, but from what I got out of the podcast and then my reading of the summaries of Aion, I did read it right, but it's like so hard to understand, so maybe I was wrong. But the Aion of Aquarius is this next age. And the Aion of Pisces is a symbol of the two fishes going in the opposite direction. The Aion of Aquarius is a man carrying water. In some symbolic representations, he's pouring out the water. So what does that mean? Well, the fish swim in water, and then Aquarius carries the water. So Jung posited that maybe it's a coming together of these two fishes, or at least the thing that they all swim in, right? So you've got the Christian worldview, the scientific worldview. Bringing them together is this next Aion. And it seems like maybe that's a good hypothesis for where we are headed with all of this buzz around Jordan Peterson. It seems like that's kind of what he's doing. He's bringing together the spiritual and the material. He's bringing together the Christian and the worldview. I don't know if I like it because I do like it because a lot of Christians have a problem with Jordan Peterson because he maybe reduces isn't the right word, but he talks about Christ as an idea, as a psychological idea. And he interprets the biblical stories through psychology. But what is the fruits of that endeavor? Well, just look at Paul Vanderklay's channel. He's a Christian pastor in Sacramento, I think, somewhere in California, and he recognized that people are coming to see the psychologist talk about God. And a lot of them are atheists, lapsed believers. A lot of them dabble in New Age stuff, psychedelics. They're looking for meaning, but they don't go to church. But they will go and watch a 3-hour lecture on the Bible from a maybe secular, maybe not. He's holding his cards close to his chest, psychologist. And he talks about the importance of this worldview and these stories from the point of view as a psychologist. And then they come to church after that. And they come into Paul Vanderklay's meetups and they talk about meaningful things that are going on in their life. A lot of times they don't even talk about Jordan Peterson. They talk about these deep ideas that they haven't had a chance to talk about with other people because they are topics of the absolute most important meaning. And I can't see that other than a good thing. Maybe it's not the best thing because it's not pointing people into a direct relationship with Jesus, but for some of them it is. James Fox Higgins, I think, had a amazing interview with Jonathan Pajot where the result of him listening to Jordan Peterson's Genesis lectures was he became a Christian, and he had a genuine religious conversion. And it wasn't like fake. He's like, I'm still struggling with it. The idea of me following Jesus is weird. And I still have a lot of doubts, but it was genuine. And so maybe that's the direction that we do need to head, is people are dropping out of the church like mad. And a lot of them do not see it as a place where they can find meaning. And I don't know why that is. It's really sad. But it seems like a lot of young people are looking for a place where they can go and they can have meaningful conversations. They can talk about these things that they aren't able to talk to anybody with. And the church is not seen as that kind of a place. And it seems like what Jordan Peterson is doing is creating a new kind of place where that can happen. And gosh, that's scary because it makes me uncomfortable as a Christian, but I see it as a good thing. And lots of tangents. I'm sorry. So where are we? This whole Aion thing. Yeah, okay. So that's my interpretation of Carl Jung's interpretation of this coming age, the age of Aquarius. But then you look at the Bible and you look at Revelation, which is unbelievably hard to interpret, and I think impossible until something happens. Then we can be like, oh, that's what John was talking about when he talked about the beast or the mark of the beast, or but a lot of things are in place to bring about those prophecies. And so I think there was something in that book about the age of Aquarius being the final age. And so I really need to, I don't know if I need to look into that and what Revelation has to say about that and try and develop some kind of prophetic interpretation. It seems like most people that do that get it wrong and end up going crazy in the process. And I almost went crazy reading this book and listening to this podcast. I'm not sure what I think about Jung. I mean, Jordan Peterson warns a lot he doesn't talk a lot about Jung, it seems like, but he is the person that influenced Jordan Peterson the most. But he seems to kind of warn people from delving into Jung because it is such a mind-shifting experience reading Jung. And I know that a lot of people like Jonathan Pajot are skeptical. Maybe I need to read more of the church fathers instead of Jung because he's so esoteric. But he will make you think, and he will shift around the ways that you experience the world. And so I'll tell you a story about something that happened to me while I was reading this book. So I was listening to this book, or at least the commentary on it. I had read Man and His Symbols and had been doing some dream reading. And then I was reading Dreams, Memories, and Reflections, which is an autobiography of Carl Jung, which was a lot more easy to read than all of his collected works. And it's just written in a way that it's a good book, but he just tells stories, and he doesn't really give you a way of making those stories applicable to your own life in the way that he does in his collected works, although his collected works are so much harder to access. So I do recommend Dreams, Memories, and Reflections because it kind of gives you an overview of Jung's life and the things that were meaningful to him and the things that drove his pursuits and shaped his thought. But one thing that he does talk about is synchronicity, and that's where a phenomena will show up in different areas of your life. So let's say you're reading a book and some sort of theme jumps out to you, and then you have a dream where that same theme jumps out to you, and then you live your life and a circumstance in your life has that theme in it as well. And for Jung, he had a dream about this figure that would show up in his dreams and sort of became a guide to him. He wouldn't call it an anima because it was a male figure, but it was something like that he would end up like having conversations with, and it would show up. And it was an old man, sort of Gandalf looking figure with kingfisher wings, so kind of angelic at the same time. And he had this very vivid, it wasn't a dream, it was a vision of this figure that he had a conversation with, and he only had a couple other visions like that before, and it was a sort of earth-shattering moment, and he didn't know what to do with it. And then a couple days later, he found a dead kingfisher in his garden. And so that's like synchronicity, these two things, this figure in his dreams that showed up with kingfisher wings, and then this kingfisher in real life sort of puts a exclamation point on that phenomenon in his life. And that's the idea of synchronicity, is things coming together. And so I was listening to Aion, and I had been doing some journaling of my dreams and trying to figure them out and stuff. And I was tearing down a woodshed in my yard. So I was listening and I was doing this manual work. I had to tear down this woodshed. And I finished taking off all of the plywood around it, and it just had the frame, and then I had to unload all of this wood. And so it was like 4 truckloads of wood. And I had just finished Man and His Symbols, and one of the archetypes that comes up in dreams a lot is a house. So if you're having a dream where you're in a house or a building and you start cleaning it, right? Clean your room. The house usually always is a symbol of your psyche. And so if you have a dream where you're cleaning your house, it means you need to clean up your psyche. You need to organize your thoughts. If you have a dream where you have a house and then you go down into a basement that you didn't know existed, right? The house is your psyche, the basement is your subconscious. So the house or a building is your psyche. And so I was tearing down this woodshed. So I didn't know it at the time, but there's definitely some symbolic importance to that. And this was in real life. It wasn't a dream. I was listening to Aion, and they're talking a lot about Christ, right? And these ideas that were kind of unsettling and disturbing to me. And I got down to the final layer of wood. So I had done like 3 truckloads of firewood, moved it to a different location so I could continue tearing this building down. And I picked up this piece of wood, and a bat was underneath it, and it flew up into my face, almost hit me. And I screamed like a little girl, like freaked me out. And it kept flying around in broad daylight for like, a good minute and a half, because I was tearing down its home. I was trying to, what's going on? Where do I land? And eventually it found a place on the side of my shed, a different shed, to land. I was like, whoa, that was freaky, and the whole rest of the day, like, my heart rate never went down from that. And I was like, what's going on with me? That it was just a bat, a little, it wasn't like we have vampire bats here in Alaska. It wasn't a big deal. It was a tiny little flying mouse, basically. But I was so on edge for the rest of the day, and it scared me so bad. And I was like, what is my problem? And I I took a lot of time to like just think right before I went to bed. My wife went to bed like an hour before I did, and I just stayed up. And I realized the symbolism of that. And I was like, oh man, at right before the foundation of this house, there is this bat. And okay, whatever. So then I went to bed and I lied in bed and it felt like the room was thick, sort of with spirits. Carl Jung has had a point in his life that he writes about in Dreams, Memories, and Reflections, where he's like the house was thick with spirits, and you could just feel them. And I closed my eyes, and I kept having these like I would want to. If I gave myself over to where my mind was going, I would have had these visions of these demonic gargoyle creatures, right? But and I kept having flashes of them, and I'd be like, no, don't think about it, don't think about it. And I was scared, but they kept sort of manifesting, and I felt like they were in the room, like maybe it was demons or something, but they had bat wings, and so I was just praying. I was laying there praying. I was saying the prayer, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ to my right and to my left. And I felt a little bit better and didn't really succumb to those demonic visions, and then fell asleep. And I kind of was anticipating really weird dreams. But I was praying for protection. And I woke up in the night sitting on the edge of my bed, and my wife woke me up, and she's like, what are you doing? And apparently I was sitting on the edge of my bed looking at the floor, yelling, just like, ah, just like frustrated, like grunt, and I realized I had been dreaming that my head was a wet towel, and it had all of these books tangled up in it. And hang on a second. Man, I keep getting interrupted. Maybe it's a sign. So anyway, my head is this wet towel thing with all these books caught in it. So I commercial fish, and it's kind of like a fishing net that has gotten twisted up with a bunch of fish in it, right? So these books, one of them is Aion, and I'm struggling to disentangle it from this towel. And I finally do, and I have it, but the towel is, with the rest of the books, is on the floor, and I'm looking down on it, yelling. And my wife wakes me up. She's like, what are you doing? I think I freaked her out. And I made some excuse like, I dropped my pillow. And then that was a very strange dream. It was like, as that was happening, it was kind of like my whole body was sort of submersed in molasses. Everything was very difficult. And it was a frustrating struggle to get this book out of this entanglement. And then the one other dream that I remember right before I woke up was I was levitating sort of above this ground, and on the ground there were all of these, I'm not sure if they were grapes or like pebbles that looked sort of like grapes, but they were glowing. They were red, and they were sort of emitting this light, and I was slowly being lowered down over them, and it was like, you're gonna touch. It was like this inevitable thing, and my arms were outstretched sort of in this crucifix pose, and my feet were coming down over these whatever they were, and then as soon as my feet touched, they sort of main contact and got submerged up to my ankles all in this moment, and I was transfixed there, and then the light from them shot up through my body, and I like started shooting out all of this light. And then I woke up. So I have no idea what the symbolic significance of all that was. But I think it was representative of my subconscious struggle with this book. It's like the experience of reading Jung, at least if you're like me and not super duper smart and can understand everything, is like you're reading this and trying to puzzle through it, and it's all so dense and complicated. But what it did to me, it did to me at the subconscious level. And so it's like most books I read, if they deeply affect me, I understand it and I understand what is happening. But this book, I read it and I didn't understand the effect it was having on me because it was having the effect on my subconscious. And it was very profound and hard to deal with, and I still don't understand what was going on. It was almost a spiritual experience, but it was also dark, in a sense. I remember at one of Jordan Peterson's Q&As, this guy, young guy in his 20s, he got a lot of crap in the comments because he wasn't very articulate, and but I really liked that interaction because he basically had a similar experience. He said, Dr. Peterson, I just want to tell you about this experience I had while watching your lecture on Carl Jung and the Lion King. And I was watching it, and I just had this intense emotion well up from underneath, from within me, and it was like I just kept thinking, what could my life be? And it was this intense sort of quasi-spiritual experience. And he's like, he couldn't really articulate it, just like I'm having trouble articulating this. But he's like, I just wanted to tell you that and see if you had anything to say. And Jordan Peterson said, well, that's probably a warning that you should never read Jung, because that will happen. He shifts around the way that you understand the world. And the guy said, yeah, I started reading Aion. And Jordan Peterson laughed, and he's like, oh, good, sarcastically, and I really relate to that guy. I don't know where to go from here. I told my wife about it, and she said, okay, so what are you going to do about it? And I said, I'm probably going to stop reading Jung. And then a week later, I started reading Psychology and Alchemy. So I don't know if this is something that would happen, though, if I didn't have the commentary from the Uberboyos to sort of make sense of it. Because if you just read it by itself, it's so hard to get through. It's like 75% of it's written in English. The rest is like Latin or French or some kind of obscure reference, and but anyway, I don't know what else to say about it, except that I'm still trying to figure out what it did to me. So there you go. Hope it's okay that I shared all that. Let me know if you've had an experience with Jung, and we'll see if I can make it through any of his other books, but probably not for a while. Probably going to go back to some of the literature and philosophy sections next. But there you go. I read a Jung book.